I'm joined now by Arturo Sarukhan. He's the former Mexican ambassador to the United States and now a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. And he's joining me from from Washington. Ambassador, welcome to the program. An easy mistake, what can I tell you?
Well, certainly these days I'd rather be in Mexico City than D.C., but...
Would you indeed? Well, why? Because I was going to ask you, what would these tariffs have done to both countries?
Because it's very painful, Christiane, to see a president single-handedly scuppering what has been built in the Mexico-U.S. relationship for the past 2 decades by mixing apples and oranges, in this case, trade and immigration policy. Not only would he have created a self-inflicted wound on the economies and on the trade flows of these 2 countries. Remember, Mexico, in this first quarter of 2019, has become now the first largest trading partner of the United States. But also by contaminating a very complex agenda, he could derail the huge advances in a very complex relationship, very fluid relationship like the one that exists between these 2 neighbors that have been achieved since the days of NAFTA in 1993.
I mean, just quickly, in terms of dollars and cents and human capital, employment and the like, what would have happened if a 5% tariff and then 5% each month up to 25% had been imposed? What difference would it made to American consumers and Mexican consumers?
Well, first of all, one of the things that President Trump seems to forget, despite having been on a Mexico bashing trend for the last 3 years, is that Mexico and the United States have developed integrated supply and production chains. What does this basically mean? It means that out of every dollar of Mexican exports to the United States, 40 cents are of U.S. input, U.S. content. So if you're slapping a 5%, 20% tariff on Mexican exports, you're slapping that tariff on all the U.S. inputs that go into every single dollar of Mexican exports. So it's not only avocados and your favorite Mexican beer. It's what happens to everything from cars to advanced aeronautic components, to heavy machinery, to surgical and medical equipment. It'll have a huge cost on consumers and on businesses on both sides of the border. I think a 5% tariff was rightable. I was one who did not want Mexico to bend the knee to Trump's ultimatums, because I think, in part because of the peso depreciation that's going on right now, that would have offset the 5% tariff, and it would have really mobilized those U.S. constituencies, governors, members of Congress, both Republican and Democrats, who understand that you can't do this when you've got 28 states in the United States that have Mexico as their #1 trading partner.
Okay, so Ambassador, you said you would have advised to ride out a 5%. But what if it had gone up to 25%? And furthermore, it looks like President Trump has brought the Mexicans to the table, has brought your president to the table, and he is declaring a victory because of these new details in the agreements over migration and trying to stop the flow of Central American migrants. I mean, if it took that punishment and, as you call it, bending the knee, I mean, is it a victory for the United States and a defeat for you?
I think it's certainly a political electoral. The president will portray it as a political electoral victory, although the details show that a lot of what had been discussed between Mexico and the United States for several months now is part of this signed agreement that was put out Friday night. There are issues there that both countries had been discussing for some time: expanded manpower on the Mexican-U.S. border. It is clear, Christiane, that Mexico, despite Trump's threats, has to do more to improve its ability to control, to regulate who comes in and who doesn't come in along our borders, and that we need to do this in a way that ensures that our own principles on asylum and refugee are not being undermined. Some of this was already being discussed. Some of it has now been agreed to in this agreement. But obviously the president is selling this to his base as a diplomatic triumph.
I want to play a little bit of what your own foreign minister said about this when asked about who's up and who's down after this deal.
Do you think the United States got the better end of the deal, or do you think it was a fair balance for Mexico and the U.S.?
I think it's a fair balance because they have more drastic measures and proposals at the start, and we reached some middle point.
So you feel like you were able to talk
Yes.
back a little bit?
Yes.
I mean, you can see, Ambassador, that your foreign minister, I mean, looks a bit shaken, frankly. I just wonder what you heard through your own grapevine of what your own country and your own government was thinking when this threat was made. And you said that, again, that you not particularly approve of President AMLO, for short, taking a knee in front of these threats. What is the reaction to what he's done in Mexico?
Well, first of all, Christiane, the Mexican delegation achieved two very important objectives as a result of these conversations. The first one is that we've ensured that the USMCA, the revamped NAFTA, and our very significant intertwined economies and trade flows survived to fight another day, and that the president did not levy punitive tariffs on both countries, which would have hurt both countries. The second one is that Mexico avoided one of the key demands of the United States, which was to agree to a safe third country agreement, which means basically that migrants coming into Mexican territory seeking asylum in the United States have to request asylum in Mexico. That has been a demand from the United States for quite some time. The U.S. will continue, is my guess, to push for this. That is what I think the president was referring to in his morning rant this morning via Twitter. But these are two very important objectives. Mexico was able to defang these two threats, and that's why I think you see a bit of a mixed sense here. Mexican public opinion, I think, in general, is concerned that what you have now is a president who will be rolling out the threat of punitive tariffs on a host of issues, particularly as we reach the high point of his re-election campaign, where he will continue to do what he's been doing ever since he ran, which is use Mexico as a piñata to fire up his base.
So let me just, given the fact that you know this and the idea of migration and the border are his fixations, that is his political base, that is what he's run on from the very beginning, it's what he declared his candidacy on. This issue is 1,000% his issue, and he believes it works at the polls. So I guess my question is, from the beginning, unless we're going to put up a graph for the moment to show the record number of travel of migrants across the border and apprehensions that happened in May of this year. It was a huge spike, the most in many, many years. I guess my question is, why wouldn't Mexico have done more? Would it have been possible to do more before you got to this threat, punishment, and talks situation?
There's no doubt that with the start of a new government, there's been a certain degree of lack of coordination, internal lack of coordination, in part because you also have government agencies in Mexico that are being, their budgets, particularly the Immigration Authority and the Refugee Authority, their budgets have been slashed as part of a broader general austerity drive by the president, and that has hurt Mexico's ability to do more, as it should, as a partner to the United States. The other thing is that you shouldn't forget that along the graph that you've just shown of arrests on the U.S.-Mexico border, Mexico in the first 6 months of 2019 has also been doing an important part of this, which is deporting back to Central American countries almost 75,000 Central American migrants. So Mexico has not been sitting on its hands either. The problem is, Christiane, you can't enforce your way out of a migration crisis. This is going to take time, it's going to take commitment, it's going to take resources, and it's going to take addressing some of the drivers of these transmigration trends from Central America into Mexico and on their way to the United States, mainly public insecurity and some of the effects of the drought per the climate change patterns that are hitting rural parts of the Northern Triangle countries, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, which is sort of driving a combination of urban migration fleeing insecurity and rural migration fleeing lack of economic opportunities.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I wanted to actually put to you something that Secretary of State Pompeo said about this very issue of climate change. Many have said that this is one of the drivers. It does fuel, as you said, what's happening, the droughts, the crop failures, etc., in Central America. But in an interview with the Washington Times, the conservative newspaper, Pompeo downplayed the climate change aspect. Essentially, he said, according to the Times, Mr. Pompeo spoke more broadly, asserting that there are always changes taking place to the climate and that as a result, societies reorganize. We move to different places. We develop technology and innovation. I mean, I guess that's exactly what's happening, that societies are organizing and moving. That is what Central American societies are doing. Do you see an irony there? And what is the solution? Because this is an issue that is going to get worse, not better.
Absolutely. I think this is the proverbial chickens coming home to roost. I think years of negating the effects of climate change are starting to profoundly impact migration and societal patterns. Yes, people adapt, and people are adapting by packing up their stuff and trekking north. If to that you add, obviously, the role of human smuggling groups that are trying to piggyback on this and make a buck by telling people it's now or never, the borders are going to shut, you'd better get on the move now. There's part of that, obviously, at play too. But we can't underestimate the effects that global change and climate warming are having on migration patterns within Latin America in general and towards the United States in particular from the Northern Triangle in Central America.
And you alluded to some tweeting that President Trump had done today, and in terms of questions about what might be next, when will the hammer fall again? He did say that there might be another immigration deal with Mexico. He once again threatened tariffs. He said the following: "We've fully signed and documented another very important part of the immigration and security deal with Mexico, one that the U.S. has been asking about getting for many years. It will be revealed in the not-too-distant future and will need a vote by Mexico's legislative body." Then he said, "We do not anticipate a problem with the vote, but if for any reason the approval is not forthcoming, tariffs will be reinstated." What do you think he's talking about? You sort of alluded to what he might be talking about, but is this the third-party asylum? Is this, I mean, what do you think he wants next?
With President Trump and his tweets, there are lies and half-lies. The lie was his tweet on Friday saying that Mexico had agreed to buy ag exports from the United States. That is absolutely false. That's not part of the agreement. It's not there. It's not even on a side letter. That issue is not discussed. Ag exports will grow if the president doesn't torpedo the ability of the U.S. Congress, the Canadian Parliament, and the Mexican Congress of getting USMCA ratified. This one today is a half-lie because obviously he's referring to trying to continue to push the third safe country agreement with Mexico. If such a deal were to be put on the table and if Mexico were to accept that, it would require congressional consultations and ratification in Mexico. So what the president is basically saying is, if in 90 days we haven't seen progress, we're going to put this issue back on the table. And he's basically saying, if the Mexican Congress weren't to ratify this, then I again will use the issue of tariffs.
And so what happens then? What does your country do? Because we've seen that he's done it once. I mean, let's face it, his own Republicans didn't like this idea. Obviously, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, has tweeted against it, saying that, temper tantrums and threats are no way to conduct foreign policy. But in a way, it did work because you have this deal that you're talking about now. So what will happen if he doesn't get this third safe country and it doesn't get put through the Congress of Mexico and he does threaten more, tariffs? What do you do? What does Mexico do?
Again, I think we should not blink, Christiane. We have to do jujitsu with one of Mexico's stronger points of containment of this president, which is the states and the governors and the members of Congress who will emphatically push back against tariffs being levied on all Mexican imports to the United States because of the disruptive economic effects that will have on the U.S. economy. I think we need to hold our ground and not blink and ensure that we are negotiating on parallel tracks. We're not going to accept mixing trade with immigration. I'm not saying that that's what the Mexican government is going to do. That's what I would like to see the Mexican government doing. I think that's where we have to make sure that we're leveraging these very important alliances that we have across the border in the United States to push back against a president who single-handedly is threatening not only USMCA, but but the future of Mexico-U.S. relations. There could be many in this city, Christiane, in the next years or so, who may be asking the very difficult question, who lost Mexico? Because the willingness of Mexico to continue building this strategic forward-leaning relationship with the United States is going to evaporate.
But where does Mexico turn then, if it's not with the United States?
Well, it's not an issue of and or. The trade dynamics, because again, I think he will not be able to reach a point of slapping relevant tariffs on Mexico because of the domestic pushback in the United States. But remember, Mexico has just modernized and upgraded its free trade agreement with the European Union. We are part of the revamped TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Mexico, along with Chile, are the two countries on the face of the earth that have the largest network of free trade agreements in the world.
It is actually quite remarkable to see how the current political dynamics are causing shifts and various different countries looking at other options to conduct their business. It's very interesting what you just brought up. Ambassador Sarukhan, thank you for joining me from Washington, in fact.